The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked as they swung open, revealing a packed gallery. Every seat was filled, the air thick with quiet murmurs and the occasional shuffle of papers. The polished mahogany walls of the courtroom reflected the cold glare of the overhead lights, adding an unsettling sharpness to the already tense atmosphere. At the center of it all stood Tyler Evans, a 17-year-old black teen, his heart hammering against his ribs as he faced the most pivotal moment of his life. He had been accused of stealing a wallet from a wealthy businessman, a charge he vehemently denied. But in this courtroom, his innocence was just a whisper drowned out by the weight of the system pressing down on him. Dressed in an ill-fitting button-up shirt and slacks borrowed from a neighbor, he shifted on his feet, his palms slick with sweat. The unfamiliar stiffness of the courtroom bench beneath him felt like a cruel preview of the prison bed they were so ready to throw him into. Across the room, District Attorney Robert Sullivan sat with an air of unshakable confidence. His tailored suit was pristine, his movements deliberate. He didn't see a scared kid standing trial. He saw another case to win, another mark of justice served under his belt. Beside him, the wealthy businessman whose wallet had allegedly been stolen whispered something in his ear, sneering in Tyler's direction. Sullivan nodded, smirking slightly before standing and addressing the courtroom. "Your Honor, today we present an open and shut case," Sullivan began, his voice smooth and unwavering. "The defendant was seen in the vicinity of the crime. He has no alibi, and the evidence speaks for itself." Judge Thomas Whitaker, a stern-faced man in his 50s with a reputation for his ruthless sentencing, peered down at Tyler over his glasses. He adjusted his robe, sighing heavily, as though this entire proceeding was just a formality before the inevitable. His reputation for being harsh, particularly on young black teens, was well known, and the coldness in his gaze sent an icy wave of dread through Tyler. Tyler's lawyer, David Harper, was young and eager but noticeably nervous. He fumbled with his papers before clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client has maintained his innocence from the beginning. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and we intend to prove that." Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Then proceed," he said, his tone making it clear he wasn't expecting much. Tyler clenched his fists, his stomach twisting as he glanced at the jury. They barely looked at him. It was as if the verdict had already been decided before the trial even began. His mother wasn't there to support him. She had passed away years ago. His father had left long before that. He had no family sitting in the gallery, no friendly faces offering. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked as they swung open, revealing a packed gallery. Every seat was filled, the air thick with quiet murmurs and the occasional shuffle of papers. The polished mahogany walls of the courtroom reflected the cold glare of the overhead lights, adding an unsettling sharpness to the already tense atmosphere. At the center of it all stood Tyler Evans, a 17-year-old black teen, his heart hammering against his ribs as he faced the most pivotal moment of his life. He had been accused of stealing a wallet from a wealthy businessman, a charge he vehemently denied. But in this courtroom, his innocence was just a whisper drowned out by the weight of the system pressing down on him. Dressed in an ill-fitting button-up shirt and slacks borrowed from a neighbor, he shifted on his feet, his palms slick with sweat. The unfamiliar stiffness of the courtroom bench beneath him felt like a cruel preview of the prison bed they were so ready to throw him into. Across the room, District Attorney Robert Sullivan sat with an air of unshakable confidence. His tailored suit was pristine, his movements deliberate. He didn't see a scared kid standing trial. He saw another case to win, another mark of justice served under his belt. Beside him, the wealthy businessman whose wallet had allegedly been stolen whispered something in his ear, sneering in Tyler's direction. Sullivan nodded, smirking slightly before standing and addressing the courtroom. "Your Honor, today we present an open and shut case," Sullivan began, his voice smooth and unwavering. "The defendant was seen in the vicinity of the crime. He has no alibi, and the evidence speaks for itself." Judge Thomas Whitaker, a stern-faced man in his 50s with a reputation for his ruthless sentencing, peered down at Tyler over his glasses. He adjusted his robe, sighing heavily, as though this entire proceeding was just a formality before the inevitable. His reputation for being harsh, particularly on young black teens, was well known, and the coldness in his gaze sent an icy wave of dread through Tyler. Tyler's lawyer, David Harper, was young and eager, but noticeably nervous. He fumbled with his papers before clearing his throat. "Your Honor, my client has maintained his innocence from the beginning. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and we intend to prove that." Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Then proceed," he said, his tone making it clear he wasn't expecting much. Tyler clenched his fists, his stomach twisting as he glanced at the jury. They barely looked at him. It was as if the verdict had already been decided before the trial even began. His mother wasn't there to support him. She had passed away years ago. His father had left long before that. He had no family sitting in the gallery, no friendly faces offering. As the trial continued, Judge Whitaker made a few more pointed remarks, barely masking his disdain. He questioned Tyler's character more than the evidence itself, mocking his mannerisms, his past, and even his presence in the courtroom. "Tell me, Tyler," the judge said at one point, leaning forward, "if you had the money, would you have been out on the streets that night? Or would you have been home, studying, being a productive member of society?" The audience, composed mostly of the city's wealthy and powerful, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some exchanged wary glances, as if realizing just how biased the judge's words were. But still, no one spoke up. No one defended Tyler. Tyler knew he was alone in this fight, but he also knew something else. He wasn't going to let Judge Whitaker break him. David Harper wiped his palms against his suit, knowing he was running out of time. The courtroom was already against them, but he had to push through. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Your Honor, we believe this is a case of mistaken identity," he began, his words deliberate. "My client has no criminal history. There are no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, and no witnesses placing him at the scene. The accusation is based solely on assumptions." Judge Whitaker scoffed, shaking his head. "A mistaken identity, huh?" He leaned forward, locking eyes with Tyler. "Perhaps you think that because you're poor and black, people just assume you're guilty." The words sent a hush through the courtroom. Even some of the jurors shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor smirked, but a few audience members whispered among themselves, their faces showing unease. Tyler's fists tightened at his sides. He had spent his whole life watching people like the judge make up their minds about him before he even opened his mouth. But this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. He took a deep breath, slowly rising to his feet. The movement alone silenced the murmurs in the room. His heart pounded in his chest, but when he spoke, his voice was clear. "That's not true," he said firmly. "I didn't do it, and I don't deserve to be treated like this." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. Even Judge Whitaker momentarily hesitated, as if he hadn't expected Tyler to push back. Tyler turned to the jury, his voice unwavering. "You don't know me. None of you do. But I know what you're thinking because I've seen it my whole life. I know that when I walked in here, some of you already made up your minds about me. You saw my skin, my clothes, my neighborhood, and decided that I must be guilty." Some jurors glanced at one another, looking unsure. The weight of Tyler's words seemed to settle over the room. "I'm 17, he continued. "I work after school to help my grandma pay rent. I don't have the luxury of messing up because, for people like me, one mistake means our whole lives are ruined. But I didn't make a mistake. I didn't steal anything." Judge Whitaker leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice laced with mock impatience. "No," Tyler said, surprising even his own lawyer. He turned to the prosecutor. "Where's the evidence?" His voice carried the weight of years of frustration, of watching others like him get swallowed by a system that never gave them a chance. If you have proof I did this, show it. If not, then why am I even here? A murmur swept through the courtroom. Even some of the spectators, who had come expecting another open and shut case, began to question the fairness of what they were witnessing. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, clearly caught off guard. David Harper, emboldened by Tyler's bravery, straightened his shoulders and turned to Judge Whitaker. "Your Honor, my client deserves a fair trial," he said, his voice stronger now. "But so far, all we've seen is bias, not justice." For the first time that day, Judge Whitaker didn't have a snide remark. He simply stared at Tyler as if reconsidering something. The courtroom remained tense, but a shift had begun. Tyler had spoken, and now the truth could no longer be ignored. Judge Whitaker's hand trembled slightly as he read the document in front of him. The color drained from his face. His usual air of dominance suddenly shattered. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, every eye fixed on the man who had just walked in, Special Agent Marcus Drake of the FBI. "I believe you should read that carefully, Your Honor," Agent Drake continued, his voice firm yet calm. He turned toward the audience, scanning the faces of the jurors and onlookers. "Because this case is much bigger than a stolen wallet." The murmurs began almost instantly, people whispering amongst themselves. Tyler, still standing, watched the judge's expression shift from shock to barely controlled anger. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, attempting to maintain his composure. "This is a courtroom, Agent Drake," he said, though his voice had lost its usual authority. "If you have something relevant to this case, then state it plainly." Drake smirked slightly, taking his time before turning to address the courtroom. "For years, Judge Whitaker has handed down disproportionately harsh sentences to young black men accused of petty crimes," he stated. "But it's not just bias, it's corruption." The room gasped in unison. David Harper, Tyler's lawyer, leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Drake walked forward, now standing directly before the judge's bench. "We have reason to believe that Judge Whitaker has been working in coordination with several private prisons, receiving financial kickbacks in exchange for sentencing individuals like Tyler Evans to unnecessarily long prison terms. These private institutions profit off mass incarceration, and Whitaker has been a key player in their operation." The air in the courtroom became thick with tension. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel down. "This is outrageous," he barked, though his voice was shaking. Drake held up a hand. "I thought you'd say that," he said, unfazed. "Which is why I came prepared." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out another document. A signed affidavit from a former employee of the Whitaker legal team, along with financial records showing direct deposits into an offshore account under your name. The courtroom erupted. Spectators murmured in disbelief, jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and Tyler, who had spent the last few days believing the system had already condemned him, felt his pulse quicken with hope. Judge Whitaker, visibly sweating now, shook his head. This is a misunderstanding." Drake didn't budge. "We also have evidence that you attempted to suppress key evidence in this very case." He turned to Tyler. "That wallet was found hours later, untouched, with every dollar still inside." David Harper immediately stood up. "Your Honor, this is grounds for immediate dismissal of my client's charges." But Whitaker wasn't listening anymore. His hands gripped the edges of his bench as if holding on for dear life. Agent Drake stepped forward one last time. "Judge Thomas Whitaker, you are officially under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy." The courtroom gasped again. 2 uniformed officers entered the room, approaching the judge's bench. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel down once more, this time in frustration. "You can't do this," he snarled. "I am the law in this courtroom." Agent Drake smiled coolly. "Not anymore." The officers took Judge Whitaker by the arms, pulling him from his seat as he continued to protest. His voice, once so powerful, now sounded small, weak. Tyler watched in stunned silence, his entire world shifting in a matter of minutes. The man who had treated him as if he was already guilty, the man who held his future in his hands, was now the one being led away in handcuffs. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Tyler Evans allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be on his side. Judge Whitaker's face contorted with rage and panic as the weight of Agent Drake's words sank in. The once unshakable authority in the courtroom now looked like a man trapped, desperate for an escape. He gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles turning white, his breathing uneven. "This is a farce," he spat, his voice trembling. "I have served this court for over 2 decades. This is an outrage." Agent Drake remained unmoved. "And in those 2 decades, you've lined your pockets with bribes, influenced verdicts to benefit the wealthy, and destroyed the lives of those who didn't have the resources to fight back." He gestured toward Tyler. "Just like you tried to do to this young man today." Tyler sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding. He had come here expecting the worst, expecting to walk out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his future stolen from him. Now, he was witnessing something no one could have predicted. The judge, who had looked at him with nothing but disdain, the man who had assumed him guilty before the trial had even begun, was now the one being accused of real crimes. Murmurs spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Some jurors exchanged uneasy glances, while members of the public whispered amongst themselves. A few people in the audience gasped audibly as they absorbed the shocking revelation. Even the prosecutors, who had been so sure of their case against Tyler, now looked visibly shaken. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel down repeatedly, his composure slipping with every passing second. "I will not be humiliated like this," he bellowed. "This is my courtroom." Agent Drake remained unfazed. He nodded toward the officers standing by. "Not anymore." 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, placing their hands on Whitaker's arms. The judge tried to shake them off, but he was outnumbered. For the first time in his life, he had lost control. "This is a mistake. I am the law here. Do you hear me? I am the law," Whitaker shouted, his voice growing desperate. But his words meant nothing now. The courtroom had already turned against him. The same people who had once feared his authority now looked at him with contempt. Tyler watched as the man who had tried to condemn him was dragged from the bench, his once polished shoes scuffing against the floor as he was escorted away. Agent Drake turned back to the judge's empty seat and then to the stunned courtroom. Justice isn't about power, it's about fairness, and today, fairness has finally prevailed. Tyler exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. His case was no longer the focus of the trial, because the real criminal had finally been exposed. As Judge Whitaker was led away in handcuffs, his shouts of protest faded into the background. The once powerful man, who had ruled his courtroom with arrogance and bias, was now reduced to a disgraced figure, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before everyone's eyes. Cameras flashed, capturing the fall of a man who had long believed himself untouchable. Tyler sat still, processing the moment. The weight of injustice that had pressed so heavily on his chest only moments ago was suddenly lifted. He had come into this courtroom expecting the worst, expecting to be judged unfairly, but instead, the real criminal had been exposed. He wasn't the one who needed to prove his innocence anymore. Whitaker had been the one hiding the truth all along. Judge Whitaker's vacant bench seemed symbolic, a reminder that no one, not even those in power, was above justice. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people exchanged stunned glances. Many of them had assumed Tyler's guilt, had judged him based on stereotypes before hearing the full story. But now they saw him for what he truly was, an innocent young man who had been unfairly targeted. The bailiff cleared his throat, calling for order as the judge overseeing the case, now a substitute brought in last minute, rose from his seat. He glanced at the prosecution, then at Tyler's lawyer, and finally at Tyler himself. There was no need for drawn-out deliberations. "The charges against Tyler Evans are hereby dismissed," the judge announced firmly. "He is free to go." A wave of relief washed over Tyler as the courtroom erupted into applause. People stood from their seats, some nodding in respect, others clapping in silent acknowledgement of the injustice that had almost taken place. His lawyer let out a breath of relief, patting Tyler on the back. Tyler turned to the audience, locking eyes with the businessman who had accused him. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence from earlier now replaced with shame. Tyler didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for itself. As he stepped out of the defendant's seat, his hands no longer shaking, he realized that this moment was bigger than just his case. This wasn't just about proving his own innocence. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that had been designed to work against people like him. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters, activists, and everyday citizens had gathered, eager to know how it felt to be the young man who had stood up against injustice and won. Tyler took a deep breath, stepping forward into the sunlight, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where his voice and the voices of others like him would finally be heard. Tyler stood outside the courthouse, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, a sensation that now felt different, lighter, freer. The weight of an unjust system that had tried to crush him was gone, and in its place was something new. Hope. Reporters crowded around him, microphones thrust in his direction, but for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a suspect. He felt like someone with a voice. "Tyler, how does it feel to have your name cleared?" one journalist asked. He met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "It feels right," he said. "But this isn't just my win. It's for every person who has ever been judged by their skin color instead of their actions. I was lucky. I had people fighting for me, but not everyone gets that chance. That has to change." The cameras flashed, capturing a moment that wasn't just about his exoneration. It was about something bigger. His words resonated, not just with those in attendance, but with thousands watching across the country. His story had struck a chord. People saw themselves in him, saw the injustice they had faced, and for the first time in a long time, saw hope. Over the next few months, Tyler's life transformed in ways he never expected. Offers poured in from universities that once wouldn't have given him a second look. Community leaders reached out, offering mentorship and guidance. His story was shared far and wide, sparking conversations about racial bias in the justice system and the need for reform. One day, as he walked across a bustling college campus, books in hand, he paused for a moment, taking it all in. He had been given a chance, a second shot at the life he was meant to have. But he knew that his fight wasn't over. As he turned the corner, heading toward a future full of endless possibilities, a young boy passing by recognized him. "Hey, you're the guy from the news," the kid said, eyes wide with admiration. "You stood up to that judge." Tyler smiled, nodding. "Yeah. And now, I'm just getting started." The camera pulled back, the scene fading into a world where Tyler was no longer just a defendant. He was a leader, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, could still be served.